Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with a brand new guest. Her name is Brandi Stanley, and she is a podcaster at This Plus That, an all around amazing human being doing important things in the world. So, Brandi, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much, Glenn. It's so great to be here. I'm glad to be talking with you.
Thank you. So, you reached out to me way back in June, and you sort of, we'll say, pitched yourself for coming on the podcast. And
Sure.
as soon as I looked at the YouTube channel and your website, I was like, yes, like 1,000 times, yes, you have to come on. And I really love the work that you're doing and the content you're putting out in the world. So I was thinking we could just start there. In a moment, I want to ask you a bit about your story, kind of
Yeah.
the deeper story of who Brandy is, but maybe tell us a little bit about your work. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, the feeling is mutual. I think the reason that you felt that way is probably the same reason that I pitched you, which
Mm,
is that I think that when you see someone doing something that resonates with what you're up to in the world and strikes a chord, it's a pretty easy like, oh, that would be very fun to talk to that person.
yeah,
So
we got to create something.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, like most of us, I have sort of a long and winding road of how I came to be at this point.
Hmm.
I think if we're talking specifically about my work and not sort of my personal history,
Hmm.
um, the sort of more recent story is, I've had about 20 years almost of branding and marketing experience. I like to say it's sort of how I knew how to monetize my art.
Hmm.
like um, this sort of intangible thing that I had that seemed to be a gift at spotting patterns and
Hmm.
making associations and sort of coming up with a nugget that was like the core thing that spoke to a very large, like a much larger thing, which
Yeah,
is a person or a company or whatever that is, and
sure.
how you might embody that in the world in a way
Mm,
that rang true with other people who you were
mm,
looking to ring true with, I guess.
mm,
And so I never really looked at marketing or branding in the way that I think a lot of modern folks think about those things. I
mm,
think for me, it was always like, what is the best and clearest way to get out your message and to speak to the truth of who you are at a core
mm,
level?
mm,
And yeah, to give you tools to help you do that in a way so that you can be more and more of yourself in the world.
mm,
And so I did that for 20 years, but
mm,
nevertheless, it's still, in late 2019, early 2020, I was coming on 3 years at my last full time job. I was a brand director. And I had decided to leave in
mm,
January 2020.
mm.
Literally, my last day was January 29th, 2020.
Just before all of hell broke loose.
Just before hell broke loose, yes. And thankfully, I had been doing freelancing for a really long time in my life, sort of off and
Mhm,
on in between all of my full time work, because,
mhm,
as creatives do, we sort of hop in and out of doing our own thing often. And so I was pretty adept at that, but it was the first time that I had left a job and I thought, I am going to start like a full time business, like not freelancing. Like, I'm really going to think about this like a business. And I decided
yeah,
to start basically what amounts to a marketing advice business. And I say a lot of this in the sort of opening episode of my podcast, but
mm,
um, I thought I could make a trade off, which was, can I do this thing that feels like a gift of mine, but not something that really speaks to my purpose? Like, if I died
mhm,
tomorrow, I just felt like this would not have actually been what I wanted to do in the world.
yeah,
I do not feel like I would have fulfilled what my real purpose is here. And
mm,
I have absolutely no clue what that is, but this just doesn't feel like it. And I'm sure I had inklings of that, right? But like
yeah,
there just wasn't a lot of clarity around it. And so I thought, okay, can I leverage 20 years of experience, help other people, but do it as little as possible and make as much as possible so that I can buy back my life? Like, can
sure.
I buy back the other hours or more hours of my life
Yeah,
so that I can do stuff that I actually love and
mhm,
feel like are really, truly fulfilling to me? And so
mm,
I spent a lot of 2020 and even actually feel grateful for the pandemic stuff in a lot of ways, in the sense that, like, I was actually, even though I left my full-time job of my own accord,
mhm,
I was granted unemployment. And
mm,
so even though starting a business was very difficult at that time, it was an online business already. It was like I could do it over Zoom, give advice. So like it was sort of like the perfect model for that kind of thing. And I had the support of unemployment to do it. But I spent a lot of 2020 sort of getting that off the ground, and it was a lot of like, how can I engineer this again to like work as little as possible, but to make as much
Yeah.
as possible and also help as many people as possible so that I can do what I love in the rest of my
Mm,
time, right?
mm,
And by the end of 2020, it was like sort of ready to just be actually like it was just time to actually do the thing. Like stop building it, actually start marketing it, get it out in the world. And as
yeah.
soon as I started doing what I did with you, which is like pitch people to like sort of start getting my stuff out in the world,
Yeah.
I began in like January 2021 to have like epic panic attacks.
Mm,
And I was so stressed. I had a ton of insomnia. I had nights where I was only sleeping like 1 to 5 hours and just, it felt like I was dying.
mm.
And the sort of cliche thing I say often is that I had this like one panic attack where I was literally like, it's what you would imagine in like a movie scene where like script writers are like, okay, if she's going to have a panic attack, put her in the bathtub and make her just sob in the bathtub, you know, and
Yeah.
that's sort of what it was like. And
Yeah.
I just had a moment where I had this like Elizabeth Gilbert thing just sort of inject into my brain that was like, you
Hmm.
don't know what next is, but this is not it. Like, you
Yeah.
can't, like,
Yeah.
whatever it is, your body is telling you that you just can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
And so I quit. I shut the business down and I just said, okay, I have the gift of unemployment still for a while. And so I'm just going to like give myself a break. I'm just going to read. I'll take walks every day. I'll do whatever. And lo and behold, I gave myself enough brain space to do that. And of course, like it sounds easy ish, but like 40 years of me doing what I do in the world sort of culminated in this moment where I was out on a walk one day in the midst of that break. And this idea of like, or I guess this like knowledge that like that gift of mine of making connections between seemingly dissimilar things
Hmm.
and like it's really a Steve Jobs quote is the description of my podcast. Really, it's connecting the seemingly unconnectable is what creativity is.
Yeah.
And I just thought like that's what something I've loved all the time. And I had spent like probably since 2018 at least in this sort of deep dive of the intersections between art and science. I got
Hmm.
really into the intersections of like art, science, and soul, really. Like
Hmm.
what are these three languages we use to sort of come up with meaning in life?
Yeah.
And so I had already been doing this mashing together of like art and science things. And so I just thought like, what if I just started like writing about like intersections that I see in the world
Hmm.
and um, like interviewing people, like not one person doing one thing and one person doing another thing, but one person who had done maybe very different things in their lives and saw interesting creative intersections at the middle of
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah.
And so I began the journey of starting the podcast and
Hmm.
got all the, as you know, like audio
All the
equipment,
things.
what's it called, designed the cover and
Yeah.
all those things. And in September 2021, I launched the podcast and I had already started writing sort of essays relatively regularly under that same name, This Plus That.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, the sort of hopefully quick end to that long story is that one thing where it was just like a method of like how I loved creativity of mashing
Hmm.
weird things together also became this container for me, actually even more so I think, of holding seemingly polar opposites in my own life, like
Yeah.
in myself, like what are the things in me that seem vastly different that I have a hard time holding the tension between, but um actually all can fit into an integrated whole. And
Yeah.
so it became, yeah, I think kind of spiritually leading a lot in the podcast to talk about these ideas of non-duality and
Sure.
polarity in our culture and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's so good. I really resonate with what you talked about, having that moment where you're feeling like you don't know what the next step is, but you know that this isn't it, and like
Yeah.
you're made for something that's more. Because I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I worked for Apple for 10 years, 11 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I was in their retail stores, and I thought I was going to be there for even longer time and blah blah blah. But then 2020 happened, and I was working at home and not in the store anymore, and I realized sitting here at my desk all day, listening to my daughter, who was 2 at the time. I'm like, I've missed so much of so many
Mhm.
important things because I'm gone all the time because I worked at store was like an hour from home. And so then I quit because I couldn't get a permanent job at home. So like 2021, I quit. And then I got a job at Starbucks, and it was like 10
Mhm.
minutes down the road. I thought I've worked at Starbucks before. This would be easy, whatever. And I was like 2 shifts in, and I had the panic attack that you just described. If they could write the script, I was on the bathroom floor, which is disgusting,
Yeah.
in Starbucks, weeping. And I called out my wife, and she's like, "What's the matter? What happened?" I'm like, "I can't do this. Like, I just have no
Yeah.
desire to be here. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but this is not it." And she's like, "Then you need to
Yeah.
go quit, come home, and we're going to figure out what we're going to do." And so I
Yeah.
came home, we let the dust kind of settle for a couple of days, and then we talked about it. And she's like, "You've been doing this podcast for so long, like you need to pour more of your time into it. I'm going
Mhm.
to get a part-time job and we're just going to make it work." And so
Yeah.
here we are. And I don't know what the next step is sometimes, but like I said, I know that Starbucks on the bathroom floor was not it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Is like I don't know, the journey of the unknown, right? Like most of this is like most of feeling, I think, fulfilled is stepping into that space where it's like maybe you have one step in front of you.
That's right. Maybe
Maybe.
on a good
Yeah.
day.
That's a
Right.
gift. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I have all sorts of questions for you, but what I really want to do is I want to focus a little bit on your spiritual journey because in the email, you mentioned to me that you grew up in Texas, I believe.
Yep.
And you worded it in a way, you said that your parents didn't directly practice Christianity, but you lived in this culture, which I can definitely imagine that demanded that you practice Christianity. So you went to this faith-based school, but then you came out as queer, and that
Yeah.
caused you to think about your faith and kind of what it was going to mean for you in this new context. So I'd love to know more just about that part of your story. Like, what did God mean to you
Yeah.
as a kid? What was this journey of coming out like, and then how did that transform or evolve how you thought about God and kind of your walk, your understanding of God?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think God meant much to me as a kid.
Mm,
I mean, I like the sort of more detail around that story
mhm,
as a child. I think was my mother grew up in Louisiana to stepmother. Really, I grew up with my stepmother. Grew up in Louisiana to like deeply Catholic parents, but
mhm,
her father was working in the mines and got sick from the mines and stopped being able to go to church at some point, and he was sort
mm,
of ostracized from the church for not attending, even though he was just sick.
mm,
And she developed this like very bad taste in her mouth around Catholicism and
mhm,
faith in general, and so they didn't go to church for her the rest of her life, really. And then my dad had parents who were just sort of like, I don't know. I feel like I would describe my dad's parents, my grandparents, as sort of like the parents for my big fat Greek wedding, but his parents, like like just to me, I think they sort of, and I'm sure like I was never old enough before they passed away or before they sort of lost cognitive function to know them well enough, but like
mm,
they always sort of struck me as the like we talked about cats, we talked about the weather, like it just there wasn't a lot of depth
sure.
and connection there
Yeah.
between all of us, and but they, from what I know, I think they went sort of regularly to some church services that were like Episcopalian
Mhm,
or Presbyterian or something, but like it wasn't, they never really talked about that. Like I never knew how faith really functioned in their lives.
mhm,
And then, so by the time I grew up as an only child, I have an older stepbrother that I didn't grow up with, but so I, for all intents and purposes, was an only child. And growing up alone with my parents, they weren't really practicing anything. I mean, I think
mhm.
when I was really pretty young, my dad would take me to like a Presbyterian church, and I deeply remember just a white man in a suit being very boring for like 2 hours.
Right. Sums it up.
Yeah, that was my experience. And then, I was in elementary school and I had friends who were Baptist. And eventually, like to sort of be friends with these people, you
Mhm,
just went to church because that's what they did on Sunday mornings. And so I
yeah.
would go to like Sunday school. And I like this sort of funny story I tell is like I just remember like being tested on things, like learning the 10 Commandments and being like, I go to school outside of this. Why would I opt into school
Right. School
like
again?
here?
Right.
And as like childhood friendships are wont to do, like they were very sort of dramatic and off and on. And
Sure.
so it was like sort of in and out of church, but like I never like I remember by the time I hit like maybe middle of middle school, I distinctly remember thinking, I have no idea who Jesus is. I've heard this name before, but I have no clue who that is. I have some concept of who God is, but like seems something like sort of out there. I don't really know. And so I wasn't really like imbued with like language for that really. And my stepmother struggled with alcoholism. And so my childhood life and teenage life was really quite difficult, and just a sort of dysfunctional household, and a lot of arguing and fighting in the house, and stuff surrounding that. And so I just, by the time I hit like high school or middle of high school, I was like just deeply hurting, like really hurting. And I met someone my sophomore year of high school who was in a class of mine and who like rode the bus home. And as sort of a shy, introverted kid, when I was younger, I sort of marvel at this moment where on like one of the first days home of sophomore year, getting on the bus, and a relatively empty bus chose to sit next to this person instead of sitting alone in a seat. And we ended up becoming somewhat friends, and eventually she invited me to like youth group things, and I started going. And I didn't know, it was like I hadn't yet been given all the dogma, which was this like beautiful moment of like, I remember once walking in high school after I had started like, I'm sure several months being in youth group, where I just felt like a hole I didn't know existed had been filled. And I was smiling, and I felt happier. And, you know, I don't think God is really just like a happy pill, but I do feel like it fulfilled something deep in me that I didn't even know was missing.
Sure.
And so without knowing the dogma, I was just like, I'm in. Like something has categorically changed in my life, and I don't know what that thing is, but it seems like it has something to do with this like God character and maybe this Jesus fellow. And so I started going to church. And I got baptized, and I did all those things that you do when you're, I don't know, in
The whole 9 yards. Yeah.
the whole 9 yards, especially in the South.
Yep.
And I ended up going to a faith-based Christian university in Arkansas. I'm sure if you know anything about those things, you can already piece those together. There's only a couple.
We're already there.
And as soon as I got there, I remember thinking like, this isn't what my youth group was. And this isn't what I feel like I was told Christianity looks like. And I didn't know how to name that or like articulate what exactly that was about what they practiced, but something didn't work for me. But I did love a lot of the people there. So I continued all 4 years there. And when I came home, I was that would have been, I don't know, 22 at the time. I started dating a guy who was a youth pastor. Like, we're just sort of following the very like Christian trajectory.
Yep.
And then we went through a breakup when I was around 24. And I don't know. I mean, I went to YWAM after that. Like, I did a trip to like Rwanda that also changed my life. But again, like, did not really love what was being practiced there, but like had an experience that was life-changing.
Sure.
And again, I'm going to try to tell this in a more brief way, but
That's good.
I eventually, around the time I was 27, I don't know, I'd had all these experiences, right? So like alcoholic household as a child, difficult sort of like figuring out my identity, like even just like what I was doing or who I was when I was a young adult. And not like often this experience of not really feeling like I fit in. So like I'd find a church and then I'd go like 80% yes, but like
something's
20%,
not right.
like something is really off. And I don't mind something being off, but like when I start asking questions about what's off, people tend to get pretty uncomfortable.
Yep.
And so this constant experience and story in my life of like finding a community, finding a church, finding friend groups, finding like identity structures, getting into those and being like, but wait, like, what about this thing that I'm seeing? And then people getting kind of uncomfortable. And so often like this sense of like not really belonging. But yes, when I was around 27, that story for me ended up being like, oh, wait a second. I think I'm actually attracted to people who I've been told are sinful for me to be attracted to. And Started exploring that, and I came out to friends and people I had known from church back home and from college, and had a relatively okay experience aside from a few good friends who were like, we think God doesn't like this about
Mm.
you. And spent, quite honestly, like 8 to 10 years grappling with untangling what it was
Wow.
to feel um, like the deepest part of me knew that this mystical thing that like was behind the universe was the deepest truth.
Mm.
And whether or not that was like through the means of Christianity, like I didn't really care, but like that was still foundationally true for me.
Mhm.
And I was queer,
Mm.
and how to like reconcile those things. And eventually, I think a handful of years into that was like, I don't think they actually need reconciling. I think these
Mm.
things are one and the same to me, no matter what I've been told.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think to wrap that up, I think it was that sort of typical story, somewhat, of like
Mhm.
maybe I didn't grow up in like deep Christianity with my parents, but like
Yeah.
found it relatively early on, and then sort of had to go through this phase of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like
Mhm.
I didn't throw out God. Like, Glennon Doyle says something to Abby Wambach that's like, you didn't leave God, you left the people who didn't see
Yeah.
God in you,
That's right.
sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so, like, I threw that out. I never really threw God out, but like, I stopped going to church, or I was like, I had periods of dipping my toe back into places that might feel okay to me,
Mhm.
but like, was really grappling with that and really mostly outside of it. And then finding a place of integration. But I think now I'm even coming to a place where I'm like, but what is it of Christianity that I actually want to keep? Like maybe it's not what
Yeah.
I don't necessarily label myself Christian, but like it's the language I know. And I think there's power in tradition and ritual, that it is part of my tradition, my past, and I'm
That's
sure
right.
even my ancestral past, like Celtic Christianity and all these other
Yeah.
things that I think are probably true for me also. And so, what is it to like take the things that I actually find to be true and meaningful and enriching to my life, and use
Mhm.
them as practices without being without having to be like so outside of, I don't know, like I'll call it outside of the institution, but not, still again like not outside of God.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think that's sort of where I've come to now.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between, for lack of a better word, deconstructing God or deconstructing what you've been told
Right.
about God. And I think that's an important distinction to make because like I've been accused so often. I grew up different than you. I grew up in the like, very strict evangelical world. I went to
Mm.
private Christian school, 4th through 12th grade, church on Sundays, Sunday school, Bible college, seminary. And like it was just drilled, all these things drilled into my head. I was like the poster child for that world.
Yeah.
And once I started to ask questions, like you
Were your
said, questions.
parents like pastors or anything, or you just had parents who practiced?
No, yeah, my parents, they practiced, but they weren't like, it wasn't like practiced a lot at home. Like we prayed and stuff like that, but they just wanted
Mm-hmm.
me to be able to go to I was causing some trouble as a youngster, and so I went to
Yeah.
they put me in private Christian school to try to kind of hone me in a little bit, and it did. I mean, there's wonderful experiences that I had there, but looking
Yeah.
back on it now, I realize how toxic so much of what I was told about God is. But that's another story. But anyway, so I started to ask a lot of questions, and like you said, questions aren't always welcomed, especially in that world. And
Yeah.
everybody's like, "Oh, now you're turning your back on God." I'm like, "No, I'm not turning my back on God. Like God is still very important to me. Jesus is very important to me, but I just have a lot of questions about the things I've been taught about Jesus. And so I need to spend some time
Yeah.
with these things, deconstructing those things and asking questions about those things. And so I didn't go to church for that. We haven't been to church in 5 years. I went through like 2 years of never opening my Bible, which was like apostasy to me because I opened my Bible every
Yeah.
day, multiple times a
Yeah.
day, but I just needed to put it all away so I could start listening to that inner voice and really kind of get, I guess, a firmer grasp on what was going on inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, I think in terms of like people who have like really influenced me too,
Mhm.
I'm sure we'll get to more of this later, but like Rob Bell has
Oh
traditionally
yeah.
been like just, um, I like if we were gonna call people like someone my guru, he would be my guru
Yeah.
probably. I followed him since 2000, since Velvet Elvis, which I
Yeah.
think was, or maybe even pre. I don't know. I think it was probably Velvet Elvis brought me to listening to.
I got the The original white hardcover Velvet Elvis right here.
Yes.
That's right.
Nice. Um, yeah, I mean, the first chapter of that book is questions.
Yeah,
It's called Questions, and I've always loved that story where he talks about how so many people think of faith as a brick wall, where like every piece of your dogma is a brick
yeah,
that you build, and if
yep,
people start to remove those bricks, then the wall crumbles. But the way he sees faith, and the way that I've come to really see faith, is like an experience to be had. It's more like a trampoline, like you invite other people onto it to experience it along
that's
with
right.
you. And
Yeah,
yeah, I think that's probably part of why I've always loved Rob Bell. Is, I mean, it's hard to not love someone who starts their work with the idea of a question,
that's
and
right.
how troubling that is to much of the institution of Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. Rob Bell changed. I mean, he helped me with so much. His Love Wins book was one of my first aha moments. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
there are other ways to think about this thing that has troubled me for so long in my life.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just led me down that road of, exploring and asking questions.
Yeah. I think
Yeah,
Rob has done a thing for most of his career, which was like give language to this thing that we had all experienced but had no idea how to articulate.
exactly.
So it was like
The original
reading Love
heretic.
Wins. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Reading Love Wins was like someone put it into words. Thank God.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So one of the things that you also mentioned in your email is that you feel more connected to the spirit, to God than ever before, and that connection has brought you two things that you were once told by Christianity are kind of off limits. And so I'm really curious as to what that means, because it was vague in the email. So I'd like some details now. But what are those off limits things that you spoke of, and kind of how have those things helped you have a better understanding of God now?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things I've loved about Rob is like this line that I think he said relatively early on, which was like this freedom of being able to name truth wherever you see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think for me, when I was sort of going through that period, especially of like grappling with like disentangling what I'd been told about faith and how that affected my like sexuality and
Hmm.
all of these different things that I was doing all these things that I think a lot of folks who have like, especially in my experience, like of queerness, that a lot of other queers have actually done, which is like, I lost this thing that was like a grounding force in my life around a
Hmm.
practice of Christianity or faith of some kind. I don't feel welcome there. There's a lot of baggage there. And so then we sort of see these other avenues that speak to some sort of mysticism, like tarot or
Hmm.
astrology or whatever that might be. And, you know, I think lots of traditional Christianity would say those things are um, like evil
Hmm.
or careful because that stuff will lead you to
Demonic.
the devil.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
they're demonic.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I just saw it's almost like personality quizzes. It's like, it's not like this is like ultimate truth. It's just a
Hmm.
tool or a lens through which to view something from a different dimension,
Yeah.
right? And so I think I often talk about, I love this line. Arrival is one of my favorite movies of all time, and
Mm.
actually, it's not. It's actually my favorite movie of all time. It's not one of. And there's this line where she talks about how something can be a tool or a weapon.
Yeah.
Like she's a translator, so she's working with language, and she's going, there's a distinct difference between a tool and a weapon.
Hmm.
And I think so often faith or really anything, I think we can make almost anything into a weapon. Science, religion,
Right.
art, whatever the case may be. And so sometimes those things can be really not good,
Yeah.
like tarot or astrology or religion, really of any kind.
Hmm.
That when they start to veer into a weapon instead of a tool, um, that they can cause a lot of harm. And
Yeah.
so it's not that I view any of those things now as good or bad. I view them as languages with which to speak about the divine in a different way.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. And I think the other thing, and you might be a little more, I don't know, do you know John Philip Newell? I know you know
Yeah.
Alexander Shia.
Yeah.
So John Philip Newell, I think, has also influenced me a lot around, I think, sort of digging into that Celtic Christianity and going like, oh, actually, like Christianity used to be much more in tune with nature and
Yeah.
actually beyond that even see. And one of the people who has deeply, deeply influenced my work is Andreas Weber. He was on the
Mm,
podcast with me, but I had spent 5 years like really digging into his book. He has a book called Matter and Desire and Erotic Ecology.
mm,
And it is really the sort of like how interconnected with nature we are and
mm,
how unseparate we are from each other. And I in all of his work had started to really see like matter as sacred.
mm.
And I think John Philip Newell has started to speak about that as well in terms of like Celtic Christianity really seeing that like everything around us is imbued with the divine.
That's right.
And that was not kosher to early church,
Yeah.
at least the Roman church and the British church, because I think those are, I think institutions and empire are always very concerned with separation.
Yeah.
This thing is good and that thing is bad. This person is good. That person is bad. These people belong to us. These people don't belong to us. Like it's
Yeah.
just a constant act of making sure that the right people are included and the right people are excluded.
Yeah.
And so I think this idea that matter is separate from the divine was a very not only like spiritually like sort of this esoteric idea that we got disenfranchised from, but I think an actual like calculated move by ancient churches to
Hmm.
go like, if everybody sees matter as sacred, then that means that we can't exploit anything. Like we
Yeah.
can't simply take from certain things. We have to see everything as actually sacred, which means that we're no different than that.
Yeah.
And it means that we can't take advantage of it or exploit it or use it to our own ends, which is a real problem for empire who wants to
Yeah.
colonize the world and do all sorts of other things that
Yeah.
include control. So yeah, I think I have a real relationship now with the idea that yes, all matter is actually sacred. And I think we're even starting to see from a quantum physics perspective that like we are mostly energy and very
Yeah.
little matter,
Yeah.
like, and that there is real truth and connection between science and religion and this idea of like us being one and the same with everything around us, and that like our energy and our thoughts can actually like create worlds sorts of
Yeah.
things, which is a whole
That's
other
right.
story. But anyway, so yeah, I think those two things, like just sort of using whatever tool or lens or language through which it felt like it gave me another dimension through which to access the divine, and yeah, seeing everything around me as sacred.
Yeah. I mean, that story is just scratching me right where I itch because
Mm.
I'm in this same kind of spot right now where, you know, like if you look at the storyline of the church, like there seems to be a point where I didn't see this at the time because this wasn't the full storyline I was given in school, but there's a point where it's like the church or the empire or whatever is pointing everybody towards like God can be found here. You have to come to the priest, you have to come to the
Right.
pastor, the
Yeah.
leader. They're going to tell you about God.
It's
But
access through
before that,
special people.
yeah,
Yeah.
but before that, it was very, like you said, very esoteric, or it was very inner. There's that inner voice, like the Gospel of Thomas. Like
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, there's a line in there where Jesus says, the kingdom of God is within you and
And
without
all
you.
around you. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when you start to listen to that, when you start to know yourself, then you will be known. It's like, oh, so it's like Jesus is pointing us inside of ourselves to find the truth, which means
Mm-hmm.
that that voice I've been told my whole life to distrust, because I've always been told, your heart is the deceitful above all things, and that's where the evil's found. You have to listen to your teachers and your pastors and the Bible and all these different things. So I've been shutting down that voice my whole life. Now I'm in this place
Yeah.
where I'm cutting that voice loose. I'm hearing all sorts of things. And like I just started using tarot cards just about
Mm.
2 months ago. And I would have never ever imagined doing that in my whole life. Yeah, I would have been like totally off limits because like I
Those are the
took
best moments.
yeah, like I took spiritual warfare classes where we were told like, those things are an entry point for the devil to come into your life. And
Yeah.
now I'm like, every morning I pull a card and I'm like, I see parallels between the card, what I've learned in the Bible, what I see in other ancient texts, whether it's Gnostic scriptures or even some like
Yeah.
Buddhist texts. I'm like, everything is connected. And there's that idea of mysticism where everything is
Yeah.
is one. And like Alexander Shia always says, all are one. Like everything is
Hmm.
connected. Everything can come to the table. Everything can speak to us. I think that's just such a beautiful way to live.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a nerdy and somewhat controversial side note. I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan, but I always love the story of Star Wars, at least for the like. I think the idea, especially I think the Ryan Johnson, like, well, I'm going to call it the Ryan Johnson texts, like
Yeah.
the storylines that he imbued into the Star Wars universe
Mm,
were this idea that the Force is within you, that
yeah.
Jedis are not some sort of like special elite group of people who have access to divinity
Yeah.
and the Force, but like actually everyone has access to that. That you don't have to be like a Palpatine or like some sort of like royal lineage in order to
Yeah.
like actually access these like higher states of being.
Right.
And I think it's so interesting actually to culturally look at people respond in a way that's like so offended by that, because
Mm,
that is empire. That's literally
yeah.
it's called empire in the
That's
movie.
right.
Even like the force of empire or the storyline of empire, if you buy into it, is that we are all separate, that you have to
Yeah.
have special access in order to have these unique abilities or communication with the divine. And Ryan comes along and is like, this belongs to everybody, bitches.
Right.
Like, you
Right.
know, which yeah, really upset a lot of people. But anyway,
Yeah. No, that's
yeah.
so true. And I mean, it's affected everything for me. Like it's really impacted the way that I view Jesus, because like I used to see Jesus as like he's like this divine being who more or less God sent to show me everything that I'm not. Like, these are all the reasons why you don't measure up. And this is why you need Jesus. So put your faith in him and he will save you from yourself and he'll save you from what I'm going to do to you. If you don't accept him into your heart, all these different things. But now I see Jesus as it's like God's way of holding up a mirror to me and showing me like this is who you are. This is who
Mm,
you've always been. And the idea is to wake up and to remember who you really are and live from that place. And like that's what salvation is. And the good news is that everybody is that reflection in the mirror that Jesus is holding up. And it's just coming to
yeah.
recognize that and living our lives from that space. I don't know. It just changes everything for me. So like I said, I still
Hmm.
believe in God. I still believe in Jesus. I just believe in it very differently than I used to.
Yeah, I think there's I don't remember where this comes from, but I feel like somewhere it comes from somewhere back in my like Christian like repertoire in my brain. The sort of line that's like there are a lot of men who would be gods, but not a lot of not a lot of gods who would be men.
Yeah.
And I think like what a powerful story, however you take Jesus to be or mean in the world. That this idea that this figure was fully God and chose to become fully man. Like
Hmm.
what an epic story of non-duality. Like what it is to hold both of those things fully.
Yeah.
And I think that gives us a lot of, as humans, a lot of I think comfort
Yep.
and going like, oh, okay, like you can be both. Like
Yeah.
like him becoming man was not some sort of like mistake
Right.
or um, yeah, um, faulty crack in the universe. Like
That's right.
it was part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's so good. All right. So last question for you. You've already mentioned Rob Bell. But one of the things I love to ask people who come on the show and kind of talk about their own faith evolution is what specific authors, books, things like that have really impacted you. So Rob Bell is kind of the one for everybody. You mentioned John Philip Newell, but who
yeah.
else has really made a big impact on you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a long line of Rob Bell converts, I think I love a lot of his loves. So John Philip Newell, Alexander Shia, and I think more than anyone, probably Peter Rollins.
Yeah.
I have really loved Peter Rollins. I think anytime someone's like, "What podcast should I listen to if I want to listen to something spiritual?" I'm like, God Part One, God Part Two, and God Part Three of the Robcast, and also The Last Guru. Those are
Yeah.
like four
Mm,
quintessential, as far as I'm concerned, podcasts that have like completely shaped my life in a lot of ways.
mm.
I had a friend listen to those once who came back to me after listening to God Part One, Two, and Three, who was like, I feel like Peter Rollins made it okay for me to be Christian again, which is just such a like powerful,
Yeah.
powerful thing. But I mentioned him already, but I think Andreas Weber, though he didn't intend to affect my spirituality, had a deep effect on my
Mm,
spirituality. Very highly recommend him. His podcast episode with me is like 2 hours of just pure, like poetic beauty.
mm,
So good. And I think also Wendell Berry.
mhm,
Wendell Berry has had a huge impact on me. And then I think folks like more modern folks like Adrienne Marie Brown and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I think have brought in for me a lot of these themes of justice and equity and meshing together of what it means to be human with each other.
mhm,
And also, I think Robin Wall Kimmerer, just sort of these like connections to nature and yeah, reconnecting to nature, I think, as part of our sort of divine lineage. So,
mm,
yeah, I think those have been some of the biggest. I think also Charles Eisenstein has had a huge
mm,
influence on me in recent years. Also, this idea
mm,
of living in the gift, in particular, that all of the universe exists in the gift, which is also a Robin Wall Kimmerer thing. She speaks about more so from indigeneity, that
mm,
indigenous cultures often practice the gift, but I think that is actually the real nature of the universe.
mm.
And
How about
yeah,
Richard Rohr? Have you read much of
oh
him?
man, yeah,
I can
I've
hear you have Rohrish vibes coming through. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think everyone, I think this is why we probably jive, right? Where it was like, yes, we should talk to each other. Cause I think
yeah,
this plus that is like another way to say non-duality, right? It's
yeah,
this thing and that thing. It's
yeah,
never just this or that. And I think Richard Rohr makes a practice in his work of just being in the center of non-duality.
yeah,
And yeah, so I honestly like, Pete Holmes, who is a Rob Bell friend,
yeah.
comedian, is a big love of mine also. And he's he calls him Richie Rohr. And so I hear Pete talk about Richard Rohr all the time. And I know he's interviewed him, which I've listened to, but it hasn't been until like really recently that I've actually started reading and then listening to. I just listened to, what is his audio? I listened to an audiobook of, oh shoot, I'm forgetting the name. But anyway, I listened to this audiobook and it was
Mm,
like mostly about, Francis of Assisi, of course, and
mm,
um, yeah, his views of non-duality and all those things and mysticism. And yeah, it was just every word was
yeah,
just complete fire. So yes,
yeah.
I'm a fan of Richard Rohr for sure.
So good. Well, hey, Brandy, we're just about out of time, but I feel like we have a lot more things we could talk about. So we're gonna have to do this again
Yeah,
and
I would love
schedule
that.
it. Yeah, we'll have to schedule it soon because I have more. I feel like we have a whole nother area to explore.
Love it. Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time for me and my listeners. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a gift to me.
Thank you. And real quick, where can people find you online? The best places to go to connect with you and your work.
Yeah, you can find me at thisplusThat.com.
Mhm.
And then on social media, which I am relatively rarely on, but I'm at This Plus That Pod on Instagram and Twitter. And yeah, my newsletter is something folks can sign up for at my website, which is where I send out my essays and also just podcast announcements and everything else, of course, like everyone else in the creative world.
Right.
And then, yeah, the podcast is just called This Plus That with Brandi Stanley. So
Awesome.
would love folks to listen to that.
Cool. I'll put all your links in the show notes and I'll be in touch.
All right. Thanks so much, Glenn.
Awesome.